Picture this: stone churches standing empty for 600 years, cradles carved from driftwood, abandoned mid-rock, farming tools rusting into the permafrost, waiting for hands that will never return. In the frozen ruins of Greenland, archaeologists found something that haunts them to this day: an entire civilization that simply stopped. No mass graves, no burned villages, no goodbye letters etched into stone. 5,000 Vikings gone. But here's where it gets strange. They didn't leave because they wanted to. The ice came for them slowly, deliberately, swallowing their farms one frozen inch at a time. And they watched it happen. For generations they watched their world turn white and cold and impossible, and somehow at the very end they just vanished. Tonight we're going to unravel one of history's most chilling mysteries, not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. No armies swept through, no plague left bodies stacked in the streets, just silence and ice, and the creeping realization that sometimes nature doesn't destroy you with a bang. Sometimes it just slowly erases you from existence. So go ahead and get comfortable. Dim those lights, maybe pull that blanket a little higher. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. And if you find yourself drifting off as we journey through these frozen ruins together, well, that's exactly what we're here for. Subscribe to continue exploring the enigmatic corners of history that make the perfect companions for sleep, mysteries that linger in your mind like frost on a window, beautiful and haunting and strangely peaceful. Let's begin where all good Viking stories begin, with murder, exile, and a marketing scheme that would make modern advertisers jealous. Chapter 1: The Golden Age of Norse Greenland. The year is 985 CE, and Erik Thorvaldsson, better known as Erik the Red, has a problem. Actually, he has several problems, but the main one is that he's killed a few too many people, and the good folks of Iceland have had quite enough of his temper. See, Erik wasn't the kind of man who took insults lightly. Neighbors' slaves destroyed some of your property, murder them. Another neighbor retaliates, kill him too. The Icelandic legal system, surprisingly progressive for the 10th century, decided Erik needed a timeout, a 3-year exile to be specific, 3 years to sit somewhere else and think about what he'd done. Now, most people in Erik's situation might have slunk off to some remote corner of Norway, kept their heads down, waited for the whole thing to blow over. Erik was not most people. Erik took his exile and turned it into a real estate venture that would define the next 400 years of Arctic history. Because Erik had heard rumors, whispers passed between traders and sailors about land to the west, land that appeared occasionally through the fog, massive and mysterious, where no one had successfully settled. So Erik loaded up his ship, gathered a crew either brave or foolish enough to follow an exiled killer into unknown waters, and sailed west into the gray Atlantic. What Erik found was not what he expected. We think of Greenland today as a vast frozen wasteland, 80% covered by an ice sheet thick enough to bury mountains. But in 985 CE, during what climatologists call the medieval warm period, Greenland's southwestern coast was actually, well, green. The fjords carved deep into the landscape were edged with grass. Willow and birch scrub dotted the hillsides. In the sheltered valleys, you could grow barley. You could raise cattle and sheep. It wasn't paradise, not by any stretch, but it was farmable land, and in the Viking world, farmable land was currency, power, and legitimacy, all rolled into one. Erik spent 3 years exploring this coastline, mapping the fjords, testing the soil, hunting the abundant seal and caribou. He was doing market research essentially, because Erik understood something fundamental about the Viking Age. Land in Iceland and Norway was getting scarce, claimed and divided and subdivided among growing populations. But here was an entire empty island ready for the taking. All Erik needed was to convince people to actually come here, to leave their established farms and families for this distant, unknown place. So Erik the Red, killer and exile, became Erik the Red, marketing genius. When he returned to Iceland after his 3 years were up, he told everyone about this incredible place he'd discovered. And here's the brilliant part. He called it Greenland, not Grey Rock Island, not frozen fjord land. Greenland. The saga writers, with what I like to think is a hint of admiration, noted that Erik believed people would be more attracted to the land if it had a good name. No kidding. This is literally the earliest documented example of false advertising in the North Atlantic, and it worked beautifully. Erik assembled an expedition that would have made any Viking chieftain proud. 25 ships loaded with families, livestock, tools, everything needed to establish a new colony. Imagine that voyage for a moment. You're leaving behind everything familiar, sailing into the unknown Atlantic on a wooden ship maybe 60 feet long, trusting your life to a convicted murderer's promise that there's green land out there somewhere. The journey was brutal. Only 14 ships made it. Storms scattered the fleet. Ice crushed hulls. The Atlantic claimed its tribute in ships and lives and hope. But those 14 ships that did arrive found that Erik hadn't entirely lied. The land was green, at least compared to Iceland, at least in the summer, at least in the good years. The survivors established 2 main settlements along Greenland's western coast. The eastern settlement, called Eystribygd in Old Norse, was the larger and more prosperous of the 2, despite being geographically further south. It clustered around the fjords near modern-day Qaqortoq, where the land was most favorable for farming. About 250 miles north, the western settlement, Vestribygd, was smaller, more remote, harder, but still viable. At its peak, Norse Greenland supported somewhere around 5,000 people. 5,000 Vikings living on the edge of the known world, raising cattle and sheep, hunting seal and walrus, building stone churches, and scratching out a living from land that gave grudgingly but gave enough. Life in Norse Greenland was never easy, but it was possible, and for these early colonists, possible was enough. The fjords provided sheltered harbors for ships and abundant marine resources. The valleys, warmed by the Gulf Stream's influence and the medieval warm period's higher temperatures, supported enough grass to feed livestock through the summer. Farmers cut and dried hay obsessively during the brief warm months, storing it against winters that could last 8 months or more. The grass in Greenland was everything. No grass meant no hay meant no cattle meant no milk, no meat, no survival. Every blade that grew was precious. But the Norse Greenlanders weren't just farmers. They were hunters and traders, and they had access to resources that made them valuable to medieval Europe's elite. Walrus ivory, creamy and lustrous, was in high demand before African elephant ivory became widely available. The tusks could grow 3 feet long, perfect for carving into religious objects or decorative pieces for churches and nobles. Polar bear pelts, massive and white and exotic, were gifts fit for kings. Narwhal tusks, those long spiral teeth that medieval Europeans believed were unicorn horns, commanded astronomical prices. Live polar bears, falcons trained for hunting, seal skins, Arctic fox pelts. All of this flowed from Greenland into European markets, bringing back iron, timber, grain, and the other necessities that Greenland couldn't produce itself. The colony even had its own bishop appointed by the church in Norway, which tells you something about Greenland's importance in the medieval world. This wasn't some forgotten outpost. This was a functioning part of the Norse and Christian world, connected through trade and church hierarchy to the wider medieval economy. Ships came regularly from Norway, bringing supplies, news, new settlers. The Greenlanders paid their taxes to the Norwegian crown, their tithes to the church. They built churches, lots of churches, elaborate stone structures that required enormous effort in a land where every stone had to be quarried and shaped and set by hand. At Valsey, they built a church whose walls still stand today, 600 years later, solid blocks of granite fitted together with Viking determination. Daily life in these settlements followed the rhythm of farming cultures everywhere, but harsher, more precarious. Women managed the households, processed wool into cloth, made butter and cheese from the cattle and goat milk, preserved meat for the winter, raised children who would know nothing but this ice-edge existence. Men tended the livestock, hunted seal in kayaks. Yes, the Norse did eventually adopt kayaks from the Inuit, at least for hunting, repaired buildings against the constant wind, cut firewood and peat for fuel. Children learned early that survival meant work, endless work, the kind of constant labor that left no room for weakness or complaint. The houses were built of stone and turf, thick-walled fortresses against the cold. Inside, families huddled around central hearths, the smoke drifting up through holes in the roof, the walls hung with everything they owned because moisture and mildew claimed anything left on earthen floors. They ate butter and cheese, preserved seal meat, dried fish when available, the occasional sheep or cow slaughtered carefully because each animal represented calories stored against the winter. They drank ale when they could make it, milk fresh in summer and soured in winter, water from streams so cold it hurt your teeth. The diet was heavy, fatty, designed for bodies that burned calories, just maintaining warmth in a land where winter temperatures plunged well below freezing and stayed there for months. In the summer, the midnight sun kept the sky light nearly 24 hours a day, and people worked those hours, desperately harvesting everything they could before winter returned. In the winter, darkness wrapped the land for months, broken only by the brief midday twilight and the dancing curtains of the aurora borealis that painted the sky in eerie greens and purples. It was a hard life, a cold life, but it was their life, and they made it work. For generations, they made it work. But here's what you need to understand about Norse Greenland's success. It was built on a climatic knife's edge, utterly dependent on conditions that seemed stable but weren't. The medieval warm period that made Greenland's southwest coast farmable was a temporary anomaly, a few centuries of higher temperatures that gave the Vikings a window to establish their colony. They arrived during the good times, and they built their entire society around the assumption that the good times would continue. They raised cattle, the ultimate prestige animal in Viking culture, instead of focusing on hunting seal like the Inuit. They grew barley when they could, European crops for European people, maintaining their identity as Norse farmers even as they lived further north than any other European agricultural society. They were proud people, these Greenland Vikings, proud of their Norse heritage, proud of their churches, proud that they could raise cattle and make cheese and live like proper Scandinavians even here at the edge of the world. That pride was their strength, the cultural backbone that let them endure incredible hardship. But pride, as we'll see, can also be a kind of blindness. When the world starts changing around you, pride can keep you from seeing what you need to become to survive. The Norse Greenlanders looked at their settlement and saw success, permanence, a new world claimed for their people. They saw cattle grazing in green valleys and thought it would always be this way. They were wrong. The ice was coming, slow and patient and absolutely inevitable. But in these early years, the golden age of Norse Greenland, they didn't know that yet. They couldn't know. They simply lived their lives, raised their children, traded their ivory, said their prayers, and prepared for winters that would eventually never end. Chapter 2. The First Warnings. The thing about climate change, whether warming or cooling, is that it doesn't announce itself with trumpets and proclamations. It creeps in 1 degree at a time, one shortened summer, one harsher winter, subtle enough that you can convince yourself it's just a bad year, just bad luck. Just wait until next season and things will return to normal. The Norse Greenlanders had several generations to notice what was happening, several generations to adapt to change, to abandon the farming lifestyle that was becoming impossible and embrace the hunting culture that could sustain them. They didn't do it. Understanding why requires us to walk through the slow catastrophe that unfolded between roughly 1250 and 1450 CE, 2 centuries during which the ice quietly, methodically reclaimed what it had briefly surrendered. The medieval warm period, that blessed window of higher temperatures that had made Norse Greenland possible, began to close around the mid-13th century. Across the North Atlantic, temperatures started dropping. Not dramatically. We're talking about average temperature decreases of 1 or 2 degrees Celsius over decades. That doesn't sound like much, does it? 1 degree colder. But in the Arctic, where survival margins are measured in weeks of growing season and inches of ice thickness, 1 degree is catastrophic. 1 degree means your grass doesn't grow quite tall enough for adequate hay. 1 degree means the sea ice stays longer in the fjords, blocking hunting grounds and shipping lanes. 1 degree means your cattle, bred for marginally warmer conditions, start dying through winters that are suddenly, inexplicably, just a little too harsh. The Little Ice Age, as climatologists call it, was settling over the northern hemisphere, and it would last, in various intensities, for the next 500 years. The Norse Greenlanders were among its first victims. Sea ice, which had previously cleared from the fjords and coastal waters by late spring, started lingering into summer. Ships from Norway, which had reliably made the crossing for centuries, found their routes increasingly blocked by pack ice drifting south from the Arctic Ocean. The growing season, already painfully short, contracted further. June frosts killed new growth. August snow came before the hay was cut. September became indistinguishable from November. The land was still green in summer, technically, but green for 6 weeks instead of 12 makes all the difference when you're trying to feed cattle through 8-month winters. The western settlement, that smaller, more remote cluster of farms about 250 miles north of the eastern settlement, was the canary in the coal mine. These were the hardiest of the Greenlanders, the families who had pushed further north into more marginal land, probably the descendants of later arrivals who couldn't find good land in the more established eastern settlement. They were tough, resourceful, accustomed to hardship. The last recorded contact with the western settlement comes from 1342, a brief mention in Icelandic records of a ship that had stopped there. After that, silence. In the 1360s, a priest named Ivar Bardason sailed north to the western settlement on some kind of official church business, perhaps to collect tithes, perhaps to investigate why no one had heard from these communities in years. What Ivar found disturbed him enough that his account survived in the historical record. The settlements were abandoned, completely utterly abandoned. Houses stood intact, doors hanging open or closed as their occupants had left them. Livestock had gone feral, cattle and sheep wandering the valleys, unclaimed, belonging to no one. The churches were empty, silent, their altars cold. Ivar's report stated simply that there was not a soul to be found, Christian or heathen, just wild cattle and sheep. Then he and his crew apparently helped themselves to some of those feral cattle and sailed back south. Because waste not, want not, even in the face of inexplicable catastrophe. Where did they go? That question has haunted archaeologists ever since. There are no mass graves, no evidence of violence or sudden disaster. The houses weren't burned, the valuables weren't looted. People had simply left, taking what they could carry and abandoning everything else to silence and the creeping ice. Several theories exist, none entirely satisfying. Perhaps the survivors migrated south to join the eastern settlement, consolidating the Norse population in the more favorable southern lands. Perhaps some catastrophic winter killed most of them and the few survivors scattered. Perhaps they were absorbed into Inuit communities, intermarrying and adopting native survival strategies. Perhaps they attempted a desperate voyage to Iceland and were lost at sea. Perhaps, the western settlement vanished and it left almost no traces of its departure. But we do know something about the neighbors who were watching all of this unfold. The Thule people, ancestors of the modern Inuit, who were expanding southward down Greenland's coast during the same period that the Norse were struggling. The Thule had migrated from Alaska over several centuries, following bowhead whales and seals eastward across the Canadian Arctic. They were brilliantly adapted to Ice Age conditions in ways the Norse never managed. Their technology, kayaks for hunting, toggle-headed harpoons, tailored fur clothing, sod houses built low to the ground, diet based almost entirely on marine mammals, represented millennia of Arctic survival knowledge. Where the Norse were trying to be European farmers in an increasingly impossible environment, the Thule were quintessentially Arctic people, and the cooling climate actually favored their expansion. The relationship between Norse and Inuit was complex and poorly documented, filtered through the Norse's inherent cultural bias and their tendency to view non-Christians as inherently hostile Skraelings. Archaeological evidence suggests occasional contact, occasional violence, occasional trade. At the Western settlement excavations, archaeologists have found Inuit artifacts mixed with Norse materials, suggesting some interaction. At some sites there's evidence of violence, burned buildings, bodies showing trauma. But there's no evidence of systematic warfare, no indication that the Inuit wiped out the Western settlement in some kind of conquest. More likely, as Norse power declined and Norse numbers dwindled, the Inuit simply moved into territories the Norse could no longer effectively control, and occasionally the two groups came into conflict over hunting grounds or resources. The Norse in their sagas and church records described heathen attacks, but how much of that was actual military conflict and how much was the standard medieval European response to encountering non-Christian peoples is impossible to determine. What's clear is that the Inuit survived and eventually thrived in Greenland, while the Norse did not. That fact alone tells us something crucial about adaptation and cultural flexibility. The Inuit didn't have better genes or superior Viking toughness or divine favor. They had better technology for the environment they lived in, and they had a culture that embraced that environment rather than fighting against it. The Norse, with their cattle and their barley and their European identity, were trying to transplant a lifestyle from one climate zone into another, and it worked fine during the medieval warm period. Once the Little Ice Age began, it became a death sentence carried out over generations. Back in the Eastern settlement, the larger and more established Norse community, people must have known something was going badly wrong up north. Ships would have brought rumors, then increasingly dire reports, then finally the priest's account of empty houses and feral cattle. But what were they supposed to do with that information? Abandon their own farms and flee to Iceland? Where would they go? Most families had lived in Greenland for generations by this point. This was their home, their land, their identity. The eastern settlement was better positioned, closer to the most favorable land, better connected to Norway through shipping routes. Perhaps they believed they could weather whatever had destroyed the western settlement. Perhaps they believed their own settlement was safe, that the cooling climate would stabilize, that next year would be better, and for a few decades, they survived. The eastern settlement persisted where the western settlement had failed, maintaining contact with Norway, continuing to export their Arctic goods, raising their cattle, conducting their trade. But the ice was patient. The temperature continued dropping, not every year, but in the long trend, decade after decade, the warmth bleeding slowly from the land. Winters grew longer, summers grew shorter. The fjords iced over earlier and thawed later. Ships from Norway came less frequently, then stopped coming at all. The last official royal ship from Norway reached Greenland in 1369, bringing officials and supplies and news from the wider world. Then nothing. No more ships. No more contact. No more lifeline to the Europe that these people had desperately tried to remain part of. Why did the ship stop? Several reasons, all compounding. The sea ice made the voyage increasingly dangerous, the kind of risk that ship captains and merchants stopped being willing to take. The Black Death had devastated Scandinavia, killing perhaps a third to half of Norway's population in repeated waves after 1349, disrupting trade networks and reducing demand for Greenland's goods. Elephant ivory from Africa was entering European markets through Mediterranean trade routes, undercutting Greenland's walrus ivory market. The Hanseatic League, that powerful confederation of merchant guilds, was reorganizing European trade around the Baltic Sea, and Greenland was increasingly irrelevant to the new economic geography. Iceland itself, the stepping stone between Norway and Greenland, was suffering through its own troubles: volcanic eruptions, plague, economic decline. The careful chain of ships and trade that had sustained Norse Greenland was breaking, link by link. In 1377, a bishop arrived in Greenland, the last one ever appointed. His name was Alf, and we know almost nothing about his tenure except that he existed, that he reached Greenland, presumably by convincing some ship captain to make the increasingly treacherous journey. After Alf, the church simply stopped appointing replacements. Greenland's tithes had stopped coming. Communication had ceased. The Norse Christian colony that had justified its existence partly through its connection to the wider Catholic world was cut off, forgotten, left to survive or perish without support or oversight from the distant church hierarchy that had once claimed authority over their souls. Picture what that isolation meant for the people living it. You're the child of Greenland Vikings, born into a world that's visibly failing around you. Your grandparents tell stories of better times, more ships, easier winters, summers long enough to harvest adequate hay. Your parents remember when Norwegian ships came regularly, bringing iron tools and timber and news. But you've never seen a ship from Norway. You've never met anyone from outside Greenland. You've never seen a tree Real trees, forests like your ancestors knew, because Greenland has no forests, just low scrub and imported driftwood. Your whole world is this collection of farms struggling against worsening cold, increasingly isolated, increasingly desperate, and there's no help coming. No one is sailing from Norway to rescue you. No one is even checking if you're still alive. The archaeological record from this period tells a story of gradually contracting settlements, farms abandoned on the margins, while people consolidated around the best remaining land, communities shrinking while they tried to maintain the core of their culture. They kept building churches, kept maintaining the Christian burial grounds, kept raising cattle even as it became harder and harder to feed them. That persistence, that refusal to change, that determination to remain Norse and Christian and European, even as the ice closed in around them, was admirable and tragic and ultimately suicidal. The Western settlement had vanished, the supply ships had stopped, the world was growing colder. And still, the Norse of the Eastern settlement persisted, believing perhaps that they could outlast the cold, that next year would be better, that their ancestors' strength lived in their blood and they would survive as Vikings always had, through determination, through hardship, through sheer bloody-minded refusal to give up. They couldn't have known they were fighting a battle already lost, that the Little Ice Age would persist for centuries, that the ice would win. From their perspective, they were simply doing what their grandparents and great-grandparents had done, living the life they knew, keeping the faith, maintaining the culture. How were they supposed to know that the world itself was changing in ways that made their way of life impossible? How were they supposed to predict that the temporary warm period that had allowed their colony to exist was ending? They didn't have climatology or ice core samples or historical temperature data. They had experience and tradition, and the reasonable assumption that if their ancestors survived here, they could too. But the ice didn't care about their determination. The ice didn't care about their pride or their churches or their cattle. The ice came anyway, grinding south, thickening in the fjords, turning green valleys white, slowly, inexorably, swallowing everything. Chapter 3. The slow collapse of Eastern settlement. By the early 1400s, the Eastern settlement wasn't thriving anymore. It was enduring, and there's a world of difference between those two conditions. Thriving means surplus, growth, optimism about the future, children who grow taller than their parents, new farms being established on virgin land, ships arriving with goods and news from the wider world. Enduring means making it through one more winter, one more failed harvest, one more year of watching your children grow up thinner and shorter than you were at their age. One more season of knowing deep in your bones that something is fundamentally wrong, but being unable or unwilling to name what it is or do anything to stop it. The environmental catastrophe that had erased the Western settlement was tightening around the Eastern settlement like a noose made of ice, and the people living through it could feel the rope tightening even if they didn't understand why or couldn't imagine any way to escape it. The permafrost was creeping. That's the detail that haunts me most when I read about Norse Greenland's final centuries. The physical fact that makes the collapse feel tangible and real across the distance of 600 years. Permafrost, that permanently frozen layer of soil, was expanding into land that had been farmable for generations. Ground that your grandfather plowed, that your father tilled, that you had worked every summer of your life, was now frozen solid year-round, impenetrable, sterile, as dead as stone. The active layer, the top portion of soil that thaws in summer and allows plant growth, where roots can penetrate and grass can grow, was shrinking, thinning, supporting less vegetation, less hay, less life with each passing decade. Fields that had produced adequate fodder for decades, that had supported families and herds through generations of occupation, suddenly couldn't grow enough grass to feed a single cow through winter. And this happened gradually, almost imperceptibly from year to year, subtle enough that you could convince yourself it was just bad luck, just a poor summer, just wait until next year when things would surely improve. But they never improved. They only got worse. And when you compared the present to memories of the past, when old people talked about summers in their youth, and you realized those summers didn't exist anymore, the change became undeniable. The land itself was dying, hardening, becoming as unyielding as the bedrock beneath it. Every spring brought a thinner layer of thawed soil. Every summer produced less grass. Every autumn arrived earlier, and every winter the frozen ground penetrated deeper, claiming more land, killing more of the earth that sustained them. Hay production was failing catastrophically, and in a society where cattle were the measure of wealth and status, where your entire identity as proper Norse farmers depended on raising European livestock, where the number of cows you owned determined your standing in the community and your eligibility to marry and your voice in local governance. This was existential collapse disguised as agricultural inconvenience. The Vikings hadn't sailed across the North Atlantic, hadn't endured incredible hardships to establish settlements in this remote place, hadn't spent 400 years building churches and farms and a functioning society just to become seal hunters like the Inuit. They had come to establish farms, to raise cattle and sheep, to live as their ancestors had lived in Norway and Iceland and Denmark, to be proper Norse people practicing proper Norse agriculture in a new land. Cattle were prestige, proof of civilization, evidence that you were a real farmer with real wealth and not some nomadic hunter scraping by on whatever you could kill. But cattle require enormous amounts of fodder to survive Arctic winters, and the mathematics are unforgiving. You need roughly 3 tons of hay to feed 1 cow through an 8-month winter. Maybe you had 10 cows, the minimum for a family to be considered prosperous, to produce adequate milk and meat and maintain breeding stock. That's 30 tons of hay you needed to cut, dry, and store during a summer that was lasting 10 weeks instead of 14, while working land that was producing progressively less grass per acre. The numbers just stopped working. You couldn't harvest enough hay during the shortened growing season to feed your herd through winters that were getting longer and colder. Something had to give. Either the cattle died, or you slaughtered them before winter and watched your wealth and prestige evaporate, trading future sustainability for immediate survival. The livestock started dying, not every year, but often enough that every household knew the sick dread of autumn, wondering if this would be the year your animals didn't survive. Archaeological excavations of Norse Greenland farms have found cattle bones from the later periods showing evidence of severe malnutrition and chronic stress. These animals were starving slowly, their bodies consuming their own muscle tissue and bone mass, trying to survive on inadequate fodder through winters that seemed to last forever. You can see it in the bones themselves, abnormal growth patterns, signs of disease, skeletal abnormalities that indicate the animals were under constant physiological stress. Imagine tending cattle through an Arctic winter, 8 months of darkness and cold, watching them grow thinner despite your best efforts, seeing their ribs emerge through their hide, hearing them low mournfully because they're hungry and there's no more hay and spring is still months away. Watching animals starve is watching your wealth die, your social standing crumble, your children's inheritance evaporate. And when your cattle die, you've lost everything. Your wealth, which in Viking society was measured primarily in livestock, your food source for the coming year, including the milk and butter and cheese that were staple calories, your ability to produce the dairy products that could be traded for other necessities, your prestige in the community because a man without cattle was barely a man at all. Some families must have made the agonizing calculation to slaughter cattle early before winter really set in, trying to preserve meat rather than watch the animals starve and lose even the value of their flesh. But that's trading future breeding stock for immediate survival, borrowing from tomorrow to eat today, the kind of desperate calculation that traps you in a downward spiral. Every cow you slaughter for immediate food is one less cow producing calves and milk next year, which means less wealth, less food, less ability to weather the next winter, which forces more desperate slaughtering, and so on until you have no cattle left at all. The pack ice was blocking the fjords for months at a time, sometimes 8 or 9 months of the year, sealing the settlements away from the ocean that should have been their highway and their hunting ground. In earlier centuries, the fjords typically cleared by late spring or early summer, opening up the coastal waters for seal hunting and fishing and travel between settlements. By the 1400s, ice was persisting well into summer, sometimes nearly year-round in the worst years, creating a frozen barrier between the Norse and the ocean resources they depended on. Ice in the fjords meant you couldn't launch boats to hunt seals during the crucial spring season when seal pups are born and seal populations are most accessible and seal hunting is most productive. Ice meant isolation between communities, each farm or cluster of farms trapped in their own valley, unable to help each other or coordinate survival efforts or share resources or even communicate about how bad things were elsewhere. Ice meant that even if a ship from Norway somehow made the crossing, even if some Norwegian captain was brave or foolish enough to attempt the voyage through increasingly ice-choked waters, they couldn't reach the settlements, couldn't deliver supplies, couldn't offer any connection to the world beyond the ice. The Norse were becoming prisoners in their own colony, watched by walls of ice that grew thicker and higher every year, cutting them off from the ocean that should have been their lifeline. Hunting on unstable ice was becoming suicidally dangerous in ways that compounded every other problem the Norse faced. They had adopted some Inuit hunting techniques over the centuries, enough to supplement their failing farming with seal meat, but they never achieved the Inuit level of expertise with ice hunting, never developed the deep intuitive knowledge of ice conditions and seal behavior and environmental signs that made such hunting survivable. The Inuit grew up learning to read ice, to understand how it freezes in layers, how different kinds of ice crack and shift, how currents and tides and temperature affect ice stability, which ice will hold your weight and which will break under you and drop you into water so cold it stops your heart before you can drown. This knowledge was taught from childhood, learned through careful observation and years of experience, passed down through generations as essential survival information. The Norse, coming from an agricultural tradition, didn't have this knowledge embedded in their culture, and learning it as adults while simultaneously dealing with changing ice conditions was nearly impossible. When you don't grow up learning to read ice to understand its moods and dangers, you die on it. The archaeological record doesn't capture individual tragedies. There's no way to find and identify the hunters who fell through thin ice and drowned in water so cold it stops your heart in minutes. The boats crushed when ice shifted unexpectedly and men were thrown into the fjord with no hope of rescue. The hunting parties who ventured onto sea ice that looked solid from shore but wasn't and simply never came home. their bodies lost beneath the ice or carried out to sea. But those deaths had to have happened with increasing frequency, adding to the toll of a community already dying incrementally from cold and starvation. Every hunter lost was one less man to work the farms, one less provider for a family, one less pair of hands in a community that needed every able-bodied person to survive. And the loss of hunters had a multiplier effect. Without adequate hunting, there was less food, which made everyone weaker, which made hunting more dangerous, because weak men make mistakes, which led to more deaths. And the spiral tightened. Economic isolation was compounding environmental catastrophe in ways that made both worse. Remember, the Norse Greenland economy had never been self-sufficient, had never been designed to be self-sufficient. It was based fundamentally on exporting high-value Arctic goods, walrus ivory, polar bear pelts, narwhal tusks, live falcons, seal skins, Arctic fox furs, to Europe in exchange for essentials the colony couldn't produce itself. They needed iron from Norway because Greenland has no workable iron deposits, needed tools and weapons and nails and all the metal goods that make farming and construction and daily life possible. They needed timber because Greenland has no forests, just low scrub willow and birch that's useless for construction, and they needed lumber for building and repairing houses and churches, for constructing ships, for fuel to supplement the peat and driftwood they could gather locally. They needed grain to supplement their limited barley production, needed manufactured goods and cloth and luxuries that made life bearable and reminded them they were still connected to European civilization. When the supply ships stopped coming after 1369, that entire economic model collapsed instantly and completely. The Norse were sitting on stockpiles of walrus ivory that nobody was coming to buy. Warehouses full of valuable goods that had become worthless because there were no buyers and no way to transport them to market. Meanwhile, their iron tools were wearing out and couldn't be replaced. Try farming or hunting or building with broken tools, with knives that can't hold an edge, with axes that snap when you swing them, with needles that break while you're sewing, and you begin to understand how dependent the Norse were on imported metal goods. Their buildings were deteriorating without timber for repairs, roofs sagging, walls cracking, churches slowly crumbling because you can't maintain stone and turf structures without wooden beams and joists and supports. Their connection to the wider world, that sense of being part of European Christendom and Norse civilization rather than isolated survivors at the edge of nothing, simply severed. They were alone, and they knew it, and the psychological impact of that isolation must have been as devastating as the material deprivation. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in waves starting in 1347, had shattered the Norwegian economy that Greenland depended on. Norway lost somewhere between a third and half its population to plague. Imagine 1 out of every 2 people you know dying within a few years. Imagine entire villages emptied, farms abandoned, trade networks collapsing, social structures disintegrating. The survivors were rebuilding their own society, dealing with their own catastrophe, not worried about a distant Arctic colony that had always been marginal to Norwegian interests anyway. Why risk ships and crews on a dangerous voyage to Greenland when Bergen and Oslo need rebuilding? Why import walrus ivory when half your customers are dead? The demand for Greenlandic goods evaporated along with the customers who had bought them. Elephant ivory from Africa was entering European markets through Mediterranean trade routes carried by Italian and Arabic merchants who had access to African kingdoms, and elephant ivory was better than walrus ivory, larger, more workable, more prestigious, and increasingly cheaper as trade routes stabilized. The market for Greenland's primary export simply disappeared, undercut by competition the Norse couldn't match. Luxury furs could be obtained from Russia and Scandinavia closer to European markets. Polar bear pelts and Arctic fox skins were still exotic and valuable, but not valuable enough to justify the increasingly dangerous voyage to Greenland when similar furs could be obtained elsewhere with less risk. The ecological goods that had justified Greenland's existence in European markets, that had made the colony economically viable for centuries, were no longer valuable enough to maintain the trade connections the colony needed to survive. The Norse Greenlanders had always been dependent on external trade, and when that trade ended, they were left with stockpiles of goods they couldn't sell and shortages of necessities they couldn't produce. The ivory trade collapse was particularly devastating because walrus ivory had been Greenland's economic foundation for 400 years. For generations, walrus ivory had been the product that brought ships and maintained the colony's connection to Europe and provided the income that allowed Greenlanders to import what they needed. Norse Greenlanders had hunted walrus intensively in the Nordre Setur, the northern hunting grounds beyond the settlements, sending summer expeditions where men would spend months killing walrus and harvesting their tusks. This wasn't casual hunting. It was dangerous, back-breaking, industrial-scale slaughter. Walrus are massive animals. Males can weigh over a ton. They have thick hides and 4-inch tusks, and they're aggressive when threatened, especially in groups. Hunting them in the Arctic required navigating ice-filled waters in open boats, approaching walrus haulouts where hundreds of animals might be resting, getting close enough to kill them with harpoons and spears and clubs, then processing the carcasses to harvest the tusks and sometimes the hide and blubber. Men died doing this work, drowned when boats capsized in ice-choked waters, killed when injured walrus attacked, lost when storms scattered the fleet, succumbed to exposure during the months-long expeditions to the Norderseter. But the ivory was worth it, worth the risk and effort and death, because ivory meant trade goods, meant survival. A single walrus might have tusks worth a year's income. A successful summer expedition might return with enough ivory to supply the whole settlement's trade needs for years. The Norderseter hunts were the economic engine that made Norse Greenland possible, the dangerous venture that justified the entire colonial enterprise. When the market disappeared, what was the point? They were risking their lives to harvest a product nobody wanted to buy, accumulating wealth that had become worthless because there were no buyers. The entire economic foundation of the colony had simply ceased to function, and there was nothing the Greenlanders could do about it because the market forces destroying them were operating in Europe, thousands of miles away, utterly beyond their control or influence. The church, which had been a source of structure and identity and connection to the wider Christian world for centuries, was failing them when they needed it most. No bishop had come to replace Alf, who had died or left or simply vanished from the historical record sometime in the late 1380s or early 1390s. No priests were being ordained in Norway and sent to Greenland to replace the ones who died. The Greenlanders presumably had some clergy remaining, priests already living there who could conduct services and perform sacraments and maintain the rituals that defined them as Christians. But that generation was dying out with no replacements coming, and everyone knew it. The churches that had been symbols of the colony's Christian identity, proof that they were civilized Europeans and not heathen primitives, were becoming hollow shells, buildings that required constant maintenance and precious fuel to heat but provided diminishing spiritual or practical support. the tithes that Greenlanders had dutifully paid for generations, sending walrus tusks and furs and whatever else they could spare to church authorities in Norway, had bought them nothing. No protection, no support, not even continued attention from the church hierarchy that had once claimed authority over their souls and promised to care for its far-flung flock. This abandonment by the church must have been spiritually devastating in ways that compounded all the other suffering. Medieval Christianity wasn't just a religion in the modern sense. It was the entire framework for understanding the world, for making sense of suffering, for maintaining hope that death wasn't the end. The church provided the sacraments that made you right with God, the rituals that marked birth and marriage and death, the community structure that bound people together, the promise of salvation that made earthly suffering bearable. When the church abandoned Greenland, when no bishops came and no new priests arrived, and the connection to Rome and the wider Christian world simply ended, the Greenlanders were left spiritually as well as physically isolated. Why was God allowing this? Had they sinned somehow, earned divine punishment? Were they being tested? Or had God simply forgotten them, left them to suffer and die at the edge of the world without meaning or purpose? These questions must have tormented people as their world collapsed around them, and there were no bishops or learned priests to provide answers. No theological comfort, just silence from a church that had taken their tithes for centuries and then abandoned them when catastrophe came. Social breakdown was inevitable under these conditions, written into the bones of the people who lived through it. The skeletal remains from later Norse Greenland burials tell a story of profound malnutrition and suffering that's difficult to read without feeling visceral horror at what these people endured. The average height of Greenlanders was decreasing generation by generation, a clear indicator of chronic undernourishment during the crucial childhood years when bodies should be growing. You can see it in the bones themselves when you lay out skeletons chronologically. The people buried in 1300 are noticeably taller than people buried in 1400, and it's not genetic variation, it's malnutrition. Height is largely determined by nutrition during childhood, and when children don't get enough food, enough protein, enough calories, their bodies don't achieve their genetic potential for growth. They stay shorter, smaller, weaker than they would be with adequate nutrition, and you can see more than just reduced height. Growth arrest lines appear in the long bones, horizontal lines where bone formation temporarily stopped because the body didn't have adequate nutrition to continue development. Imagine being so hungry during childhood that your very bones stop growing, that your body shuts down development to conserve energy, that growth pauses and waits for food that might never come. Skeletal evidence shows smaller overall frame sizes across the population, evidence of rickets and scurvy from vitamin deficiencies, dental problems from poor nutrition, bone diseases from inadequate calcium, all the physical signatures of a population that simply wasn't getting enough to eat. These people were literally shrinking, their bodies unable to achieve normal human development because they weren't getting enough food, enough nutrients, enough of what human bodies need to grow and function properly. Vitamin D deficiency was widespread and devastating, which seems almost paradoxical in a place where summer brings 24 hours of sunlight, where the sun never sets for months, and you'd think people would be swimming in vitamin D. But it makes terrible sense when you understand the Norse diet and lifestyle. Vitamin D comes from two main sources: sunlight exposure on bare skin and fatty fish, which are extraordinarily rich in the vitamin. The Inuit, whose diet was almost entirely based on marine mammals and fish, got abundant vitamin D from their food even during the dark winters when there was no sunlight to synthesize it. Seal blubber, fish oils, whale meat, all loaded with vitamin D. The Norse, stubbornly maintaining their European agricultural diet focused on dairy products and beef, eating butter and cheese and milk and preserved meat from their precious cattle, and apparently eating very little fish despite living on the coast beside seas teeming with fish, were becoming profoundly vitamin D deficient. Archaeological analysis of Norse Greenland garbage heaps, those wonderful middens that archaeologists love because trash tells truth about how people actually lived, show remarkably, incredibly few fish bones. The evidence is stark and puzzling. The Norse were living beside fjords full of cod and char and salmon, surrounded by an ocean abundant with fish, and they weren't eating them, or eating them only occasionally, in quantities far below what would be nutritionally beneficial. Why? Because fish wasn't part of their cultural identity as proper Norse farmers. The Inuit ate fish. The Inuit were hunters and fishermen, following the seasons and the migrations of marine animals. The Norse were farmers who raised cattle, and farmers eat beef and dairy, not fish. That cultural distinction, that stubborn adherence to European foodways, even in an environment where those foodways were literally making them sick, was killing them. They were vitamin D deficient, which weakens bones and causes rickets in children, and probably contributed to higher mortality during childbirth and infection and general illness, all because they refused to eat the abundant resource surrounding them, because eating fish would mean admitting they were more like the Inuit than like their Norwegian ancestors. Infant mortality was almost certainly spiking, though the archaeological record on this is fragmentary because infant bones are small and fragile and often don't survive centuries of burial. But the logic is inescapable. When you're living at the edge of survival, when mothers are malnourished and stressed and cold, infant survival plummets. Babies born too small because their mothers didn't have adequate nutrition during pregnancy. Babies born too weak to survive their first winter. Mothers without adequate nutrition, unable to produce sufficient breast milk, leaving infants to starve even when the mother survived the birth. Children dying through their first winter, their second winter, their third winter, never reaching adulthood. Entire generations thinning out faster than they could be replaced. Bloodlines ending not with violence but with quiet tragedy in cold houses where food ran out before spring arrived, and children too weak to cry just stopped breathing. The population was dying, not quickly enough to leave evidence of catastrophe, not suddenly enough to show up in the historical record as some specific disaster, but steadily enough that the colony was slowly bleeding to death. Every winter took more people than were born the following summer. Every bad harvest meant some families didn't survive. Every hunting accident meant one less provider. Every mother who died in childbirth meant multiple deaths, her own, possibly the infant, and whoever else in the family couldn't survive without her labor. The mathematics of population sustainability were failing, and there was no way to reverse the decline because the underlying conditions, the cold, the failing farms, the isolation, the lack of supplies, kept getting worse. Interfamily marriages were increasing, evidence of a contracting population with fewer marriage options, fewer potential partners, a gene pool that was shrinking along with everything else. When your settlement starts marrying cousins to cousins, when the same family names appear again and again in what records survive, when you can trace how everyone in the community is related to everyone else within 2 or 3 generations, you're looking at a community that has shrunk below sustainable population levels. Genetic diversity declines, which increases the risk of inherited health problems and genetic disorders. Inherited health problems compound in small intermarrying populations, leading to more weakness, more illness, more deaths. The social fabric tears because everyone is related to everyone else, and there's no fresh blood, no new perspectives, no immigrants, because who would immigrate to a failing colony at the end of the world where everyone is starving and freezing and dying? The Norse Greenlanders were becoming, in the most literal demographic sense, a dying people, and they had to have known it, to have seen it in their children's faces, in the empty farms where families had once lived, in the graves that multiplied while births declined, in the terrible arithmetic of more deaths than births that meant extinction was not just possible but inevitable if nothing changed. And here we reach the most tragic aspect of Norse Greenland's collapse, their cultural stubbornness, their absolute refusal to adapt Inuit survival techniques, even as evidence mounted that the Inuit way of life was succeeding where Norse farming was failing. The Inuit were thriving in the same environment that was killing the Norse. They were hunting seal with sophisticated technology developed over millennia of Arctic existence, traveling in kayaks that were far more efficient and maneuverable than Norse boats, wearing tailored fur clothing that provided far better insulation than woven wool, living in sod houses designed specifically for Arctic conditions rather than stone buildings designed for Scandinavia. Every piece of Inuit technology represented centuries, millennia really, of accumulated knowledge about surviving in the Arctic, knowledge that the Norse desperately needed and apparently refused to adopt except in the most minimal ways. Why? Pride, primarily. Cultural identity. The Norse had come to Greenland as European farmers, as Christians bringing civilization to the edge of the world, as representatives of Norse culture and tradition, planting their flag in new territory. Adopting heathen Inuit technology would have meant admitting that their own culture was inadequate, that the supposedly primitive natives understood survival better than they did, that European civilization with all its churches and farms and supposed superiority was actually inferior when it came to living in the Arctic. For medieval Norse Christians, the Inuit were Skraelings, a derogatory term implying something less than fully human. Pagans living in ignorance of Christ's salvation, primitives without proper religion or agriculture or civilization. How could you adopt the technology and life ways of people you considered inferior? How could you abandon cattle ranching and become seal hunters without admitting that everything your ancestors built was wrong? That the entire Norse colonial project in Greenland was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what was required to survive here? How could you stop being Norse, stop being European, stop being the people you believed you were meant to be, without losing your entire identity, without admitting that you failed? So they didn't adapt, or adapted only minimally, taking a few Inuit tools and techniques, but never the wholesale lifestyle change that was necessary. They kept raising cattle on shrinking pastures even as it became mathematically impossible to feed them. They kept building European-style houses with stone walls and turf roofs that were harder to heat than Inuit sod dwellings built low to the ground. They kept wearing wool clothing that provides some insulation when dry but becomes useless and even dangerous when wet, unlike Inuit fur clothing that maintains insulation even in moisture and is far better suited to Arctic conditions. They kept trying to be Norse in an environment that required you to be Inuit, and the environment killed them for it. Not quickly, not dramatically, but absolutely, inevitably, with the patient thoroughness of ice closing over water, with the certainty of mathematics and biology and climate physics. The archaeological evidence of this refusal is stark and damning. Very few Inuit artifacts found in Norse settlements compared to what you'd expect if there were significant cultural exchange or adoption of Inuit technology. Very few fish bones in Norse middens compared to Inuit middens from the same period and same region. Continuing evidence of cattle ranching right to the end, even during the final generation when the environmental conditions made cattle survival nearly impossible, even when logic and reason and survival instinct should have screamed at them to slaughter the cattle and focus on seal hunting. The Norse Greenlanders watched the Inuit succeed at surviving, watched the Western settlement vanish, watched their own children starve and shrink and die, and still couldn't bring themselves to change, to adapt, to become something other than what they believed they were meant to be. It was civilizational suicide by cultural inflexibility, death by pride, extinction through the inability to admit that maybe, just maybe, the old ways weren't working anymore and something radically new was required. They had the example living right next door. The Inuit showed them every day that survival was possible if you adapted to the environment rather than trying to force the environment to adapt to you. But accepting that lesson would have meant abandoning their identity as Norse, as European, as Christian farmers, and apparently that was a price they couldn't or wouldn't pay. So they paid with their lives instead, slowly, over generations, watching their world fail and their people die and still clinging to the cattle and the churches and the European identity that defined them right up until there was nobody left to cling to anything. By the early 1400s, the eastern settlement was a ghost of its former self, a scattered remnant of farms barely hanging on, communities too isolated and too weakened to help each other. Families watching their children grow up thinner and weaker than they had been, knowing that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong, but unable or unwilling to do what was necessary to survive. The ice was winning, the cold was winning, the mathematics of population sustainability and agricultural viability and economic isolation were all pointing toward the same inevitable conclusion. Time itself was running out, though they didn't know it yet, couldn't see that they were the last generation, that in a few more decades there would be no more Norse Greenlanders, just empty houses and silent churches, and the wind howling through abandoned settlements where 500 years of European civilization in the Arctic would simply cease to exist, erased as thoroughly as if it had never been. Chapter 4. The Final Mystery. The last piece of written evidence we have from Norse Greenland is a marriage document dated September 16, 1408. It's mundane, almost painfully so, recording the wedding of Thorstein Olafsson and Sigrid Björnsdottir at Valsey Church, witnessed by community members whose names are carefully recorded according to proper church procedure. The bride and groom, the witnesses, the priest who performed the ceremony, all dutifully documented as though this were just another wedding in just another year in a settlement that would continue indefinitely. But it wasn't just another year. It was, as far as we know, the last time anyone in Norse Greenland put pen to parchment and left a record for the future. After 1408, silence. Complete, absolute, historical silence. Imagine being at that wedding, standing in Valsey Church with its thick stone walls blocking the Arctic wind, watching two young people make vows to each other, promising a future together, promising children and grandchildren, and the continuation of their line. Did anyone there know they were watching the end? Did the priest understand that this might be the last Christian marriage performed in Greenland? Did Thorstein and Sigrid have children? Did those children survive? Did anyone survive? We don't know. The written record ends, and what happened next exists only in archaeological fragments and educated guesses, and the terrible certainty that sometime between 1408 and the mid-15s, when European explorers returned to Greenland and found only ruins, the Norse presence simply ceased. Church records from this period, or what fragments survived in Norwegian and Icelandic archives, mention heathen attacks on Greenland. The language is vague, panicked, filtered through religious prejudice and geographical distance. The term heathen could mean Inuit, attacking Norse settlements in raids or wars. It could mean European pirates, English or Basque fishermen and raiders who were increasingly active in North Atlantic waters and might have descended on isolated Greenland settlements to take whatever they could steal. It could mean nothing, rumors and paranoia from a colony that knew it was dying and needed an external enemy to blame rather than confronting the reality that their own choices and the climate itself were destroying them. We have mentions of attacks, of danger, of trouble, but no details, no clear picture of what actually happened. The climate during these final decades was reaching its coldest point in the Little Ice Age's initial phase. Ice core samples from the Greenland ice sheet, those cylindrical sections of ancient ice that preserve atmospheric conditions layer by layer going back millennia, tell a story of dramatic temperature decline. The years around 1400 to 1450 show some of the coldest temperatures in the entire historical record for Greenland. The ice sheet itself was advancing, grinding forward incrementally but inexorably, reclaiming land that had been free of permanent ice for centuries. Glaciers were moving down from the highlands into valleys that had been farmland. The green land that Erik the Red had discovered was turning white and dead, and the Norse who had settled there were trapped in the path of that advancing ice with nowhere to go and no help coming. The archaeology from the final Norse generation is heartbreaking in its specificity. Excavated graves from this period show signs of severe chronic malnutrition. Bone analysis reveals people who were protein deficient, vitamin deficient, calcium deficient, their bodies slowly consuming themselves because they weren't getting enough food to maintain basic metabolic functions. Some skeletons show evidence of tuberculosis, a disease that thrives in malnourished populations living in close quarters. The average height of adults buried in late-period graves is noticeably shorter than earlier generations, indicating that these people experienced severe nutritional deprivation during childhood, stunting their growth permanently. These weren't healthy people dying of old age. These were people who had been slowly starving for years, decades, their entire lives perhaps, their bodies the physical manifestation of a society in terminal decline. Some bodies were buried in positions facing away from the church, a detail that has fascinated and troubled archaeologists since its discovery. In medieval Christian practice, bodies were traditionally buried facing east toward Jerusalem, toward the rising sun that symbolized resurrection. Finding bodies deliberately buried facing other directions suggests either a breakdown in church authority and traditional burial practices, or possibly some theological desperation, some shift in belief when faced with suffering that seemed to indicate God had abandoned them. Did the survivors lose faith? Did they blame the church for their suffering? Did they simply no longer have priests who knew or cared about proper burial orientation? We can't know, but the physical evidence suggests that even death rituals, those most conservative of cultural practices, were breaking down at the end. The last generation was buried in shallow graves in frozen ground. Digging graves in permafrost is brutal work, requiring enormous effort to chip through frozen soil, and the shallow depth of late-period graves suggests that survivors either didn't have the energy or the tools or the population necessary to dig proper graves anymore. Some graves show signs of hasty burial, bodies interred without the careful preparation and grave goods that characterized earlier Norse burials. This wasn't proper treatment of the dead according to Norse Christian tradition. This was exhausted survivors doing the minimum necessary to get bodies into the ground before they themselves died. The graves tell us that by the end, the Norse Greenlanders were too weak, too few, too desperate to maintain the rituals that had defined their culture for centuries. Critically, there's no evidence of a massacre, no mass grave, no indication of sudden violent death for the entire population. If the Inuit had overrun the settlements in a war of extermination, we'd expect to find bodies with trauma, burned buildings, evidence of violent destruction. If European pirates had attacked and slaughtered everyone, same thing, some archaeological signature of violence at scale. We don't find that. What we find is gradual abandonment, farms left empty, houses that fell into disrepair rather than burning, a population that seems to have just dwindled away, thinned out, failed to reproduce itself until there was nobody left. So what happened? Where did they go? Several theories exist, none provable, all plausible to varying degrees, and the truth might be some combination of all of them because history rarely has neat, singular explanations for complex events. Theory 1: starvation and gradual abandonment. The simplest explanation is that the population slowly died out from malnutrition and cold, and toward the very end, the last survivors, maybe a few dozen people, maybe a couple of families, abandoned the settlements and attempted to reach Iceland or died trying. Perhaps they heard that a ship was stopping at some distant point along the coast, and the remaining survivors trekked across impossible terrain trying to reach it. Perhaps they built or repaired boats and attempted the voyage to Iceland, a desperate gamble for people who knew they were dying anyway. Perhaps some of them actually made it, arriving in Iceland as nameless refugees who assimilated into Icelandic society without anyone recording where they came from or documenting that they were the last survivors of Norse Greenland. This theory is depressing in its mundanity. No dramatic ending, no final battle, just a slow fade to black as people died or left and were forgotten. Theory 2: captured by pirates. English and Basque fishing fleets and pirate vessels were increasingly active in the North Atlantic during the 1400s. These weren't explorers or legitimate traders. These were hard men operating at the margins of European society, harvesting cod and walrus in Arctic waters, raiding settlements when opportunities arose. If pirates descended on the weakened Norse settlements, they might have killed the men, captured women and children as slaves, and left the settlements abandoned. Slavery was still very much a part of medieval European society, and human captives from a distant location where no one would come looking for them would be valuable. Some historical sources mention English ships taking fish and people from Greenland, though the references are vague and disputed. This theory has some supporting evidence, but it doesn't explain why there's no archaeological evidence of violent destruction in the settlements themselves. Theory 3: assimilation into Inuit communities. As the Norse population declined and Inuit population expanded, some Norse survivors might have joined Inuit groups, either through intermarriage, through capture and adoption, or through desperate necessity when their own communities collapsed. There's some genetic evidence that might support this. Some modern Greenlandic Inuit populations show trace amounts of European DNA that could date to the medieval period. The Inuit oral tradition includes stories about Kavdlunait, foreign people who lived on the land before the Inuit, though the details are vague and might refer to earlier populations or might be purely mythological. If some Norse survivors were absorbed into Inuit culture, they would have left almost no archaeological trace because they would have started living as the Inuit did, abandoning their failing farms and adopting mobile hunting lifestyles. Their descendants might be alive today, carrying a tiny fragment of Norse DNA with no knowledge of their ancestors' origins. Theory 4. Mass evacuation attempt. Perhaps the remaining Norse attempted one final desperate voyage, loading everyone they could onto the last functional ships and sailing for Iceland, gambling that death at sea was preferable to slow starvation in Greenland. The North Atlantic is littered with the wrecks of ships that didn't make the crossing, and most leave no trace, no survivors, no record except absence. If the last Greenlanders perished attempting to escape, they would simply vanish and we'd never know. This theory explains the lack of bodies in Greenland, but requires assuming that enough ships were still functional and enough people remained healthy enough to crew them, which seems questionable given the state of the settlement by 1450. Theory 5. Plague. Some historians have suggested that disease, possibly carried by a ship that arrived in the early 1400s, swept through the weakened population and killed most of them, with the few survivors fleeing or dying soon after. The problem with this theory is that we'd expect to see skeletal evidence, mass burials, bodies showing disease markers, something to indicate epidemic mortality. We don't find that. The graves suggest malnutrition and gradual decline, not sudden epidemic death. However, not all diseases leave skeletal evidence, and if a plague ship arrived and introduced infection to an isolated, malnourished population with no immunity, it could have been devastating without leaving obvious archaeological traces. The most likely explanation, in my estimation, is some combination of all these factors rather than one single cause. The Norse Greenland population was already dying slowly from starvation and cold. Their numbers were dwindling, their health was failing, their communities were isolated and unable to help each other. In this weakened state, they became vulnerable to anything. Pirates who would have found well-defended settlements too dangerous suddenly found easy targets. Diseases that a healthy population might survive became lethal. Winters that previous generations endured became unsurvivable, and the final survivors scattered in different directions, trying desperately to escape a place that had become a death trap. Some might have been taken by pirates. Some might have died attempting to sail to Iceland. Some might have joined Inuit groups. Some might have simply died in their houses as winter closed in and never opened again, their bodies eventually consumed by time and weather and animals, leaving no trace for archaeologists to find. What we can say with certainty, based on climate data that modern science has reconstructed, is that the environment became genuinely unsurvivable for the Norse lifestyle. Ice core samples from the Greenland ice sheet show the temperature drop with brutal clarity. Tree ring data from across the North Atlantic confirms catastrophic cooling during this period. Sea ice records, reconstructed from multiple sources, show the fjords frozen 9 months or more out of the year, making both farming and traditional Norse hunting impossible. The Greenland ice sheet itself was advancing, reclaiming valleys that had been ice-free farmland, literally swallowing the green land that had given the colony its name. The land itself, which Erik the Red had discovered green and promising in 985, was turning back into the frozen wasteland we know today. The medieval warm period that had created a brief window for Norse settlement was definitively over. The Little Ice Age, which would persist in various forms until the 1800s, had locked the Arctic back into deep freeze. The Norse had arrived during an environmental anomaly and built their entire civilization around the assumption that the anomaly was permanent. When the climate snapped back to its normal Arctic state, the Norse way of life became impossible, and the people who clung to that way of life died. The tragedy is that survival was possible. The Inuit proved that by thriving in the same environment that destroyed the Norse. But survival required becoming something the Norse refused to become. It required abandoning farming for hunting, abandoning cattle for seals, abandoning European identity for Arctic adaptation. The Norse couldn't or wouldn't make that transformation, and they vanished. The ice swallowed them, just as surely as if a glacier had literally crushed their settlements. It just took centuries instead of minutes, slow enough that every generation could convince itself that things weren't really that bad, that they could survive one more year, that surely next year would be better, until there were no more years, no more survivors, no more Norse Greenlanders, just empty houses and silent churches and graves in the frozen ground, waiting for modern archaeologists to find them and try to understand what went wrong. Today, if you visit the ruins of Norse Greenland, you'll find something that feels less like archaeology and more like walking through a ghost story that hasn't quite ended. The stone churches still stand, their walls defying 6 centuries of Arctic weather, granite blocks fitted together with Viking precision, holding firm against wind and ice and time. Valsey Church, where that last documented wedding took place in 1408, remains remarkably intact, its empty windows staring out over a fjord that freezes solid every winter. You can stand in that church, place your hand on stones that medieval hands cut and shaped, and feel the silence pressing in, the weight of all those vanished lives. The farms are there too, or their foundations anyway, stone outlines marking where families lived and loved and raised children who never grew old. Some of these ruins are emerging from beneath retreating glaciers, exposed by the same climate change that's warming Greenland now, 5 centuries after it froze the Norse out. The wheel has turned. The ice that buried Viking Age farms is melting away, revealing perfectly preserved artifacts, clothing, tools, even organic materials that survive centuries of frozen preservation. Archaeologists are finding things that haven't seen daylight since the 1400s, messages from the dead in the form of everyday objects, a comb carved from bone, a child's toy, a knife with its wooden handle intact, all emerging from the ice like bodies floating to the surface. The irony is almost painful. Greenland's southwest coast is becoming farmable again. The temperatures that made Norse settlement possible in 985 are returning in the 2020s. The land that Erik the Red discovered green and then watched turn white over centuries is greening again, and within our lifetimes, people might farm the same valleys where Viking cattle grazed 1,000 years ago. The climate cycle that destroyed Norse Greenland is reversing, but the Norse aren't here to see it, aren't here to reclaim their empty settlements and say, "We knew we could outlast the cold." They lost their bet against the ice, and by the time the ice releases its grip, they've been gone so long that nobody even remembers their names. What can we learn from this? What does Norse Greenland's collapse tell us that matters beyond historical curiosity? Several things, actually, and none of them are particularly comforting. First, climate change destroys civilizations. Not might destroy, not could destroy. Does destroy, has destroyed, will destroy again. The Norse didn't have fossil fuels or carbon emissions, didn't cause the climate change that killed them, but they died from it just the same, because they couldn't adapt fast enough to environmental transformation. Temperature changes that seem small on paper, 1 degree, 2 degrees, translate to catastrophic shifts in agricultural viability, in ecosystem productivity, in the fundamental habitability of places where people have lived for generations. Second, cultural rigidity kills. The Norse Greenlanders had a model for Arctic survival literally living next door to them. The Inuit were thriving using technologies and strategies that worked in the environment as it actually existed, not as the Norse wished it would be. But adopting those strategies required admitting cultural inferiority, required abandoning the identity as European Christian farmers that justified the Norse presence in Greenland. Pride, cultural pride, identity, the belief that their way of life was inherently superior to the primitive Inuit way, prevented the adaptation that would have saved them. They chose to die as Norse rather than survive as something else. Third, isolation is fatal when crisis comes. When the ships from Norway stopped arriving, when the economic and social networks that sustained the colony broke down, the Norse Greenlanders were trapped. They couldn't trade their ivory for supplies. They couldn't call for help. They couldn't evacuate when conditions became unsurvivable. They were alone at the end of the world, and when things went wrong, there was nobody coming to rescue them. Modern society likes to think we're more connected, more resilient, that our global networks protect us from the kind of catastrophic isolation that doomed the Norse. But networks break, supply chains fail. When disaster strikes, you can't always count on someone else to save you. Fourth, incremental disaster is harder to respond to than sudden catastrophe. If a volcano had erupted and buried the Norse settlements in ash, the survivors would have fled immediately. The response would have been obvious and urgent. But climate change that unfolds over generations, environmental degradation that happens slowly enough that each year seems almost normal, creates what psychologists call shifting baseline syndrome. Every generation accepts the new worse conditions as normal because it's only slightly worse than last year, and humans are extraordinarily good at normalizing gradual decline. The Norse Greenlanders watched their world fail slowly enough that they never quite reached the point where abandoning everything and fleeing felt necessary, until suddenly it was too late to flee at all. And finally, perhaps most disturbingly, sometimes there is no happy ending. Sometimes the protagonists don't figure it out, don't adapt in time, don't survive to tell their story. The Norse Greenlanders were tough people, survivors by any measure, descendants of Vikings who had crossed oceans and carved farms from wilderness. They endured hardships that would break most modern people. They persisted through centuries of increasing difficulty with remarkable determination, and they still died, still vanished, still left nothing but ruins and bones and unanswered questions. Courage and determination and strength of character don't guarantee survival. Sometimes the world changes in ways that make your particular survival strategy obsolete, and if you can't change with it, you die. The Norse Greenland settlements stand as monuments to human ambition and human stubbornness, to the incredible things people can achieve and the tragic ways those achievements can fail. They're monuments to the dangers of refusing to adapt, to the fatal consequences of pride, to the brutal reality that nature doesn't care about your culture or your identity or your determination. The ice came, the Norse couldn't or wouldn't change fast enough, and the ice won. It's that simple and that complicated. Where exactly did the last Vikings go? We'll probably never know with certainty. The mystery will remain, frozen in time like those artifacts emerging from the glaciers, tantalizing and incomplete. Maybe some made it to Iceland and were absorbed into the population there. Maybe pirates took them. Maybe they died attempting one final desperate voyage. Maybe some lived long enough to see the Inuit finally move into the empty settlements, the new owners of a land the Norse had tried and failed to claim permanently. Maybe the last survivor died alone in a stone house, looking out at ice that stretched to the horizon, knowing nobody was coming, that this was the end, that everything their ancestors built would be forgotten. But here's what we do know. They lived. For 400 years they lived on the edge of the world, raised families, built churches, told stories, laughed and cried and loved and died in one of the harshest environments humans have ever attempted to settle. They were people as real and complex and human as you are, and for a few centuries they carved out a life in a place that was trying very hard to kill them. That they ultimately failed doesn't erase those centuries of survival. That the ice won in the end doesn't diminish the courage it took to live there at all. So as you drift off tonight, think about those stone churches standing empty in the Arctic wind. Think about the houses where families gathered around fires, trying to stay warm through winters that lasted most of the year. Think about children born into a world that was slowly dying, who never knew that somewhere far away, in places called Norway and Iceland, their distant cousins lived easier lives. Think about the last person to leave Valsey Church after that final wedding in 1408, pulling the heavy door closed behind them, walking out into the cold, not knowing they had just witnessed the end of something that would never be rebuilt. The ice came slowly, patiently, inevitably, and it swallowed an entire civilization. But before it did, people lived there, and their lives mattered. Their struggles meant something, even if all that's left now is silence and stone and the wind whistling through abandoned halls where Vikings once drank and laughed and believed they would last forever. Rest well. The ice is far away and the cold cannot reach you here. Tomorrow is another day, and you are warm and safe, and the world outside will wait until you're ready to face it. The Norse Greenlanders would have envied you this comfort, this security, this absolute certainty that spring will come and the ice will not swallow everything you know. Sleep now. The mysteries of the past can wait. The empty churches will still be standing when you wake, patient as the ice that surrounds them, silent witnesses to a vanished world that once was green.